In 2009, tensions rose to a breaking point between the FIA and FOCA, who represented the teams. With many major disagreements, particularly around Max Mosley's proposed £30 million budget cap, 8 of the teams decided to form their own breakaway series, called the Grand Prix World Championship. Now other people have already done videos on this subject, so if you're not familiar with this planned breakaway series, I recommend you watch one of these first. Personally, I don't think any of the teams were seriously planning on joining a breakaway series and probably just used it for negotiations with Max Mosley and Bernie Ecclestone. But it's still a very interesting topic, so this video will cover what the Grand Prix World Championship would have looked like if they had actually broken away from Formula 1 after 2009, while a second part will be released covering what would be left of Formula 1 in this scenario. So in this alternate timeline, the FIA and FOCA just cannot come to an agreement, leading to 8 teams: McLaren, Ferrari, Braun, Red Bull, BMW Sauber, Toyota, Renault and Toro Rosso leaving Formula 1 at the end of the 2009 season, to join a new series, called the Grand Prix World Championship in 2010. So what would the Grand Prix World Championship look like? Well, the most important thing about the GPWC was that it would be run by the teams themselves rather than working with any governing bodies like the FIA. It would be similar to how kart was in American open-wheel racing and the DTM Championship in Germany. This could lead to the same problems that both championships had, with team bosses prioritizing themselves over the long-term health of the series, and being very stubborn when it comes to rule changes. An example of this from kart was how Roger Penske owned Ilmor, who was building the Chevrolet engines for Penske and some customer teams, and he used this power to change the rules to benefit his team and engine supply. So maybe teams like Ferrari and Mercedes could try the same thing in the GPWC. The Grand Prix World Championship would need a CEO to run the series. As far as I'm aware, they never announced who this could be, but I do have one idea. What if in this timeline, John Todt decides not to run for the president of the FIA, and becomes the CEO of the Grand Prix World Championship instead? I could see this happening due to the Frenchman's ties to Ferrari, but the only problem for Todt is that now he would only be in charge of one series, rather than having control of multiple major championships, which could prevent him from achieving some of his goals, such as creating the World Endurance Championship in 2012. Alternatively, Max Mosley said in an interview that Flavio Briatore saw himself as the next Bernie Ecclestone, so maybe he could be the CEO instead. For the regulations, the GPWC planned on using cars running to identical regulations to what we saw in the real F1 2010 season, since there wouldn't have been enough time to make new rules from the ground up. This could lead to legal problems due to the FIA owning the F1 rules, but there are no alternatives for such a short amount of preparation time, so they will have to settle it in court. There are other questions about this new series, such as what would the weekend format be and what point system could be used. Do they stick with the 2009 point system, or could they create their own point system from scratch? Or what qualifying format do they use? I will assume that the weekend format and points would be identical to F1 in 2010, although it's not impossible for them to have chosen a different format. Now let's move on to the calendar. After the breakaway series was announced, a potential 17-race calendar was leaked. However, this calendar had many major issues. Some tracks were already contracted to hold F1 races on the same or similar dates. Bernie Ecclestone had personal contracts with races like Singapore. Some tracks were only at FIA Grade 2, some track owners said they had never been contacted by the series, and Helsinki Thunder in Finland no longer existed. Many have suggested that this calendar release was more of a publicity stunt and a threat than anything else, which I do personally agree with. However, since this is the only information we have on the 2010 GPWC calendar, for this video I will use a modified version of this calendar for the 2010 season. Firstly, I will keep the Grade 2 circuits on the calendar, such as the ones in Argentina and Mexico, since modifications could be made to bring the tracks up to safety standards and the GPWC could use their own grading system. Next, I will be dropping all of the races that already had a contract with Formula 1 in 2010, with the exception of Silverstone, Montreal, and Abu Dhabi. Silverstone and Montreal were yet to sign contracts for the 2010 season, so I think they would switch to the new series, and I think Abu Dhabi would be one of the few places to be able to afford to pay for both an F1 and GPWC race in 2010. Sadly, I will have to drop the Finnish Grand Prix because it would be impossible to hold due to parts of the track being impossible to use due to construction projects. For similar reasons, Surfers Paradise would not be able to hold the Australian Grand Prix, so the season finale would be held in Adelaide. Now let's get some substitute races. Replacing the Monaco Grand Prix will be the Dutch Grand Prix, however this won't be held at Zandvoort due to its poor facilities at the time and instead will be held at the TT Assen circuit, which is most well known for bike racing, but also held a round of the Champ Car World Series in 2007. Next taking Finland's spot will be the Czech Republic Grand Prix at the Brno circuit, which once again is most well known for bike racing, but does also hold car races. The Italian Grand Prix will simply be relocated from Monza to Mugello, which hosted the Tuscan Grand Prix in 2020. I was thinking of moving the date of this race to avoid a clash with the Formula 1 race at Monza, but since GPWC would have Ferrari, I doubt they would be worried about losing too many fans to F1. Next will be the most obscure track on this new calendar. The Singapore Grand Prix will be replaced by another Southeast Asian street circuit, in Indonesia. For those that don't know, the A1GP series had begun work on a street circuit in Indonesia to hold a race for them in 2009. Sadly the series never raced there, so the circuit only ever hosted small national races until it was closed in 2012. But I think that the GPWC could take advantage of this and add it to their calendar. Finally, the Japanese Grand Prix, like the Italian Grand Prix, will simply relocate to Fuji Speedway, which had hosted the Japanese Grand Prix in 2007 and 2008. So here's the new 2010 Grand Prix World Championship calendar. Personally, I think that it would be great to see the return of some fan-favorite circuits, and countries that hadn't held an F1 race in years could finally see top-level open-wheel racing again. My only major problem is that many of these circuits are going to be too tight and technical for good racing, especially since this was the year before DRS was introduced, so some of the races could be quite boring to watch. With the calendar out of the way, let's move on to the teams and drivers of the Grand Prix World Championship. All of the 2009 F1 teams excluding Williams and Force India will be part of the GPWC, although Toyota would announce their withdrawal from Grand Prix racing at the end of 2009, leaving us with 7 founding teams. All of these teams would end up with the same driver lineups, although I think that Pedro de la Rosa would do the full season since I predict Nick Heidfeld would get a seat in F1 in this scenario, but I'll explain that in the next video. Of course you can't run a championship with just 14 cars, so more teams would need to join. Luckily, around 15 different teams were looking at joining F1 in 2010 and based on my research, it seems that some would rather have been in a rival series than F1 due to problems with the FIA. The first is ProDrive, who at this time were most well known for running the Subaru World Rally Team and the Aston Martin Endurance Racing Program. ProDrive had previously tried to enter F1 in 2008 as a McLaren B team. However, they were barred from entry after Williams protested, stating that they were trying to run customer cars. They tried entering F1 again in 2010 but were rejected. I imagine that in the GPWC, ProDrive would take a somewhat similar approach to that of Haas in 2016, being a McLaren B team running cars similar to the previous season's McLarens, but with a different livery depending on their sponsor, which in this case I assume would be Gulf, who were sponsoring their Aston Martin program at Le Mans. In 2008 it was widely believed that the driver lineup would have been Pedro de la Rosa and DTM champion Gary Paffett at ProDrive, since they were both McLaren test drivers. While Paffett was still available in 2010, Pedro had gone to Sauber. Personally, I think that the second ProDrive seat would go to Heikki Kovalainen, who raced for McLaren during the previous 2 seasons. Pace-wise, I imagine that ProDrive with their McLaren partnership would be a bit quicker than Sauber and Toro Rosso. Next up is Lola, who had previously entered F1 in 1997. Lola had applied to enter F1 in 2010 but withdrew their F1 entry a few days before the breakaway series was announced, so fans speculated at the time that Lola would enter the Grand Prix World Championship instead. Sadly, I imagine that Lola in the series would have a similar existence to that of HRT in the real world as a clear backmarker. Lola had made it clear that they had eyes on signing Northern Irishman Adam Carroll, who had just won the final A1GP championship in 2009. The second seat would have to go to a pay driver. For this season, I will give them Argentinian driver, Jose Maria Lopez, who is now more famous as a Le Mans winner, but at the time was supposed to race for the failed USF1 team in 2010. The GPWC would have their first ever race in Argentina, so I imagine that Lopez and his sponsors would much rather be here than in Formula 1. Third is N Technology, who were an Italian team who had previously ran Alfa Romeo's World Touring Car program in the 2000s. By 2009, both had left the WTCC and N Technology had applied to join the Formula 1 grid in 2010, having previously built the NT07 for feeder series racing. N Technology were rejected by the FIA, although the Italian team decided to take legal action, since they believed that there had been irregularities in the selection process of new teams, but this case was rejected by the court. I could see N Technology racing in the GPWC in this scenario, but sadly I imagine that they would be a backmarker alongside the Lola team. Giancarlo Fisichella had been negotiating with Sauber for a drive in 2010, with Ferrari offering the team engine discounts if they signed him, and while Sauber didn't accept this offer, I imagine that the Italian would be a great option for N Technology, since he could bring experience and Ferrari engines to the Italian squad. The second driver would have to be a paid driver to help keep this new team afloat. It really could have been anyone, but for this video I'll go with Narain Karthikeyan, who in reality spent 2010 racing in NASCAR, although he was also trying to get a seat at Stefan GP. Speaking of which, let's talk about the Serbian team. Stefan GP had tried entering Formula One with the unraced 2010 Toyota F1 car, and while they were unsuccessful in reality due to their late entry attempt, I imagine that the Grand Prix World Championship would have been more accepting of an additional team due to the risk of there being a lack of entries. Part of me also wonders if the GPWC would pressure Toyota into giving Stefan GP more support, since Toyota were a founding member of the GPWC, and depending on what the contracts looked like, maybe Toyota won't be able to leave as easily as they left Formula One. Pace-wise, the Toyota 2010 car has always been a hot topic, with some suggesting that the Japanese car would have been the fastest on the grid, like Brawn GP the previous year, while others suggest that it would have been a midfield car just like Toyota had been throughout their time in F1. For this video, I'll go with them being the fourth best team. Kazuki Nakajima would almost definitely have driven for the team due to the Toyota connection, but the second seat is a bit more interesting. 1997 world champion Jacques Villeneuve was looking at returning to F1 in 2010, just like his old rival Michael Schumacher. The Canadian did have a seat fitting with Stefan GP and seemed to be the most likely to get the drive, so I will make him the second driver. So here is the lineup for the 2010 Grand Prix World Championship season with 11 teams and 22 cars on the grid. So overall, it's an excellent lineup for the inaugural season, with 5 F1 world champions and 6 additional race winners, with other drivers going on to win championships and races in the future. So with all that said, how would the inaugural season go? Well, championship battle-wise, it would be similar to the real world, with the same 5 drivers in title contention and potentially one of the Stefan GP entries depending on the pace of the Toyota. In reality, it's impossible to predict who would have been champion in this season given how close it was between the top drivers. There are 17 races on this calendar, and in the real F1 season, round 17 was the Korean Grand Prix. So for a bit of fun, here is how the final race of the 2010 Grand Prix World Championship season would have gone in Adelaide if it had been identical to the Korean Grand Prix. It's a rainy day in Adelaide, but the Australian fans are excited as their home driver Mark Webber is leading the World Championship heading into the final race of the season, and in the best car he is looking like the favourite to win the inaugural Grand Prix World Championship. The Australian spends the first part of the race running in second, which is good enough to win the championship. Things were going well, until...
Over 2 minutes on that opening lap, and Webber's wide.
Oh, Webber's spinning round. Webber could come and crash, and Webber has gone crashing into the wall, and Webber could collect someone else. He has done. The championship leader is out of the race.
His dream of becoming the inaugural Grand Prix World Champion was over, leaving teammate Sebastian Vettel to lead the race. He led the race comfortably and looked like he would become champion, until with 10 laps remaining.
Engine failure. Engine failure. Engine is gone. Engine is gone.
Understood.
Completely out of the blue, Fernando now led the race. And Lewis was up to second, and more importantly, back up to third in the championship chase.
This is what I call a very lucky season, my friend. Very lucky season.
It really did look like his title race had gone up in smoke. Gutted. The team could barely believe it. No points from a 1-2 start. But they put a brave face on it.
Fernando Alonso would go on to win the Australian Grand Prix and become the inaugural Grand Prix world champion with Ferrari. Red Bull would be gutted to lose the Drivers' Championship but would still win their first Constructors' Championship. So overall, I'd say that the Grand Prix World Championship would have an excellent opening season, which would be important in attracting an audience and gaining sponsors. While the on-track action would be good, off-track I could see the Grand Prix World Championship being a mess. Setting up a new championship in under a year would be very difficult and there would probably be a lot of teething problems for the World Championship. For example, let's say that there is a similar incident to the Fernando is faster than you controversy at the German Grand Prix in 2010. How would the GPWC handle the situation and what would be the consequences? If they're too harsh on Ferrari, maybe the Italians would threaten to go back to Formula One, while if they're too lenient, maybe the other teams would vote to find a new CEO. But what do you think? Would you have watched the 2010 Grand Prix World Championship? And who do you think would have won the championship in the inaugural season? Let me know in the comments section, and I will see you in the next video where we will look at the 2010 F1 season in this timeline.